Okay, hello everybody. I think we're going to get started for tonight. So today, I want to welcome you all. Today is the fifth day of our 7-part lecture series on deconstructing racism, this one being pro-diversity and anti-bias education. This is organized by GCC's Social Sciences Division, the Associated Students of Glendale Community College, and Student Equity. I want to thank you all so much for tuning in tonight to learn as a community in hopes that education will drive us to action. I do have a few announcements before we begin. We have interpretation and closed captioning services available tonight for our deaf or hard of hearing attendees. You do have the option of pinning the interpreters by clicking on the 3 dots in the box where their faces can be found. You can also follow along with closed captioning. A transcript will be saved after the event. This lecture will be recorded and published on glendale.edu/antiracism at a later date if you want to find that later on. We will be having a 1.5-hour lecture on pro-diversity anti-bias education, followed by a 30-minute Q&A. And additionally, for GCC students only, we will be having a healing circle open immediately after this event, led by GCC counselors to provide students with a safe space to discuss and process the heavy topics that will be covered tonight. And a separate link to the healing circle will be sent in the chat later on. To introduce myself, my name is Isabella Martirosian, and I am the incoming Vice President of Finance for the Associated Students of Glendale Community College. Without further ado, I would also like to welcome our presenters today, Mary Jane Biancheri, Assistant Professor of Child Development, William Sparks, Adjunct Associate Professor of Child Development and former education analyst for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and Sandy Somo, Assistant Professor of Sociology. So I welcome you all tonight.
Thank you so much, Isabella. So I'm Sandy again from Sociology, and Mary Jane and Bill?
Hi, I'm Mary Jane, and I'm in Child Development.
Hi, I'm Bill Sparks, and I teach in the Child Development Department.
And we are so excited to have you all with us today. The first thing we really want to do is just drive home kind of the main point for us tonight, which is that it's not enough to just support diversity or try to not have biases. We have to actively create diverse spaces and also teach others to resist bias. And so hopefully by the end of tonight, you'll have a few tips from us on how to do that. So who is this presentation for? So it's for current and future educators, people who have children, people who are around children or have children in their lives, anyone who would like to learn about anti-racism or anti-bias education, and then anyone who believes that education, both formal and informal, can make a difference. So basically, I truly believe this is for everyone. So we're thankful that you're with us tonight. Okay, so today's agenda. So we just did the welcome and introductions. In a moment, we'll do some group check-in and some reflection before we get started. Then we'll talk about some common anti-bias language, and then we'll dive into anti-bias education. So we'll talk about how we select readings for various age groups. We'll talk about the 4 core anti-bias goals, and we'll also talk about how we teach and learn about racism and anti-racism. We will end with a call to action, some resources, and of course, our Q&A at the last half an hour. Speaking of Q&A also, if you have questions, make sure that in the chat box, you select my name, Sandy Somo, and send your questions to us. All right, so the first thing I want to do is do some check-ins with each other. So my question for you is, how are you all doing today, right? I want you to choose one word that describes how you're feeling right now, just one. Go ahead and go into the drop-down menu in the chat box, click on my name, and type in your response. I want to see how you're doing today. And then for those of you that want to kind of also start thinking about what the next question is, it's going to be on where you first remember hearing about like race. Your first experiences. Ooh, I got managing, fantabulous. Ooh, I like that one. I got quite a bit of tired, some frustrated, pretty good. Ooh, emotional stressed, I'm sorry. Great, unproductive, motivated, optimistic. Ooh, fired up. I love that. Yes, that's how I'm feeling. All right, cool. So then your second question, folks. I want you to consider for a moment and sort of just reflect a little bit on how were the ideas of race first introduced to you. I want us to all think about that for a moment. And then we also want to share with you too. We want to model that. Mary Jane, did you want to go first on this one?
Sure. I share this a lot in my classes when we talk about this, but I have very distinct memories of asking about differences in different realms of my life as a small child, and I have very distinct memories of my hand being squeezed, and that message being, and I got the message, stop talking, or even, my forearm being squeezed. And, when I would say, why is that person's skin color different than mine? Or why is that? My first memories of being curious about it it's not something to talk about. What about you, Bill?
First heard about it in the sense of which street I could not cross. So the largest shopping center near us was also across the street from a historically Black college and university. And I said, well, I was told that's the limit of your shopping. You go to this store, that store, but you don't go outside that other store, because then you'd cross the street and be in a Black college. And the second way was in church. We drove to church in the middle of the city. This was the city of Baltimore, in the state of Maryland, which owned slaves and had Confederate units from the state of Maryland. And anyway, we drove to church through a Black neighborhood, went in the church and locked the doors and wouldn't let Black people come into our church. And my father was one of those ushers at the door to politely send African Americans off to some other church. Strict boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bill. For me, the ideas of race were first introduced to me because I lived in a really kind of diverse environment. And so it was kind of normal for me to grow up in an area where that was just normal and common. However, there was definitely a lot of us versus them tensions. And I do recall that. And I definitely recall colorism, right? Like I definitely, I have two family members that are definitely more brown. And I realized from a very early age that lighter skin tones were more favorable. And also I have two sisters that are like blonde with blue eyes. And I realized that that was more favored over like my hair color of like brown with brown eyes too. And so I learned those messages pretty early on when I was young. And then like I knew that it was wrong, right? But it took a while to kind of unlearn all of these. I really also appreciate those of you that have kind of sent in some responses. Here are a couple. Someone says, my father had to talk with me about what it's like to be a Black man in America. Someone else said they learned about race when they were a young child. They had family friends who were of a different race. Someone else said, I lived in the Middle East and there were no Black individuals who lived in my country. I met a South African national and I wanted to ask him so many questions, but I felt it wasn't right to do so. Someone else wrote, my mother's white and I'm mixed and my earliest memories relate to hair differences. Yep, me too. And my mom, taking me to a Black hairdresser. I asked about, I'm sorry, I'm losing it because there's so many people responding now. I asked about why we were different and that's how I started to learn. Someone else said experienced it at 16 when a Black teenager slowed down crossing the street to delay me turning right at a traffic light. When I first moved to Canada from Armenia, a complete change of culture. Okay, I was born in the Soviet Union and before it was separated, we were taught in school that all the people in the world are the same. I believe they had this policy back then to promote the idea of equity. The Soviet Union included countries with different nationalities and different traditions. I'll do one more. I grew up in a predominantly Latino community. I didn't learn about race until I was bused to the Valley in the 9th grade. Thank you all so much for sharing. We really appreciate it. Okay, so let's talk some common language, right? So probably, especially for those of you that are not new to this work, or you've been attending the other lectures in these series, probably already know these words, but just in case, we'll go through these really quickly. Anti-bias is opposing or prohibiting unfair discrimination against people based on race, religion, etc. Diversity is differences in racial and ethnic, socioeconomic, geographic, and academic or professional backgrounds. Equity is freedom from bias or favoritism. It's also important to keep in mind that the difference between equity and diversity is about outcomes, right, specifically. Inclusion, the act or practice of including and accommodating people who have historically been excluded for any reason. Empathy, the ability to recognize, understand, and share the thoughts and feelings of another person, animal, fictional character, etc. And then anti-racist, someone who's actively opposed to racism, not just like not racist, right? Okay, Phil, take it away.
Teaching is a transference of values. What you don't put out says as much as what you do, says Dr. Harriet. How do we choose the books to read and share with children in early childhood ages, defined as ages 3 to 7? Next. So when I was a teacher in public school in the first grade, one year the mandated curriculum said every child should read this book. And I had just learned about anti-bias education. So the book is from 1740. It's a story of a family in 1740 in New Hampshire, and they are a farm family. And the other 12 books we had to read, none of them had African Americans in them either. So I struggled with, what am I going to do with this? So a craft project was part of this curriculum. So we all made cardboard wagons with paper, and we had a little toy cow to be the ox. But in my classroom, we put a secret compartment in the bottom of the wagon. And the secret compartment was a big secret. We didn't tell other people who came and looked at our display. It was a big secret between us. The tension rose. The students wanted to know what's going to be in the secret compartment. And of course, they guessed candy, but next slide. It was an African-American family, because the ox cart family were actually part of the Underground Railroad, smuggling African Americans to escape to Canada, which was one of the borders that African Americans had to reach in one of the periods of slavery. So in this little way, I could talk about a large, broad, wide social justice issue in a little mandated kindergarten book. And this is one of the things we do. One of the techniques we use when we have a printed mandated curriculum, we alter it in a major way or a minor way. Next. So another thing we use in early childhood is we expand the traditional use of dolls. And in our programs, we have used a technique by making these dolls about 2 foot long, very bigger than most dolls. And we call them persona dolls because we give them a backstory. We give them a name, we give them a history, we give them a story of their family or of the family's trips and movements around the world. And these dolls whisper in our ears, and we tell the students what the doll wants to say or ask. And it goes the other way. The students get to say or ask to the doll. And through these various stories that we make up for the personas, we get to bring up issues which usually aren't talked about. They're also useful when something happens in the room and you don't want to call out the child in public, but the doll can call out the same issue. "He called me a blank," says the doll. And you don't have to go directly to the child, a kind of an indirect way of bringing up the issue. Next. So also college students in our classes like to make dolls, and some make them like themselves because they never had a doll that looked like them. And that's a whole issue in itself about what's in the market. Other students make dolls to serve a purpose in their classroom. So they want to have a lighter, a darker, a shorter, a child with a disability. Next. So we also look at what's for sale. Have the students been able to find the kind of doll they wanted in the stores? Next. So the dolls tell us, the persona dolls, they all wear similar everyday clothes, which is different than a lot of other programs who dress each ethnic doll in a specific historical or celebratory ethnic costume. So we purposefully have the children have these dolls dressed in everyday clothes because the dolls are mostly like us with their cultural and ethnic differences. And one of the anti-bias activists actually wrote a whole book about this technique. Next. So let's compare some stories because there's stories about Mr. and Ms. Potato Head. So there's stories about Barbie. So we read these stories and we talk about them and we stumble upon some research. This is at the college level. 20 12-year-old girls played with Mr. and Ms. Potato Head for 6 weeks. 20 other 12-year-old girls played with Barbie for 6 weeks. Then each group was asked to list all the careers they could possibly take when they became adults. Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head group's list was twice as long as the group that played with Barbie. In early childhood education, we include family stories. So part of what's in our community, what's in our classroom is what's the family doing? What's the family do on the weekend at special days? So we hear stories like the Armenian memorial story. And we know that very young children are sent and hear about the history of their ethnic, cultural, or national group. So this is an Armenian genocide and our community's role in asylum in Pasadena. And one drop comes from the top of the apex every second to the pool at the bottom. And over a year, you get the number of drops of the number of people that the genocide killed. We notice that families and toddlers participate in these memorials and in these remembrances. Next. Other things that we do in early childhood include having materials that students can accurately represent themselves. This is crayons for skin color. And we have the same thing. We do field trips in early childhood. So here's a field trip to the African American Black Firefighters Museum on Central Avenue in LA. Next. So the next part of the day, we took children to visit Lincoln Park. Now you can see that that monument is a long way from a 5-year-old's ability to get close to Lincoln and know much about him. But we tell the story anyway. But children interpret their visits in different ways. Right next door to the Lincoln Memorial is a pond, and this pond had a dead turtle. And the child I was with wanted to know 99 things about a dead turtle. He even tried to scoop it up with his new plastic fire hat because we had been at the firefighter museum 2 hours before. So for him, the emotional marker of this day is dead turtle. But if you ask him what else was there, he can tell you part of the story about Abraham Lincoln. Next. So let's go to another memorial that helps us connect to the African American history. So there's a bust of Jackie and his brother Mac Robinson outside of Pasadena City Hall. The kid was glad to see he could see what Jackie looked like, but then he did a typical childhood thing. He gets close. Whoops, go back. He gets close and he says, "I'm Jackie Robinson's Q-tip." Well, this is not what we were thinking with the story of Jackie Robinson and the Dodgers and baseball, blah, 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 blah. But the next thing that the child found was in the backside of Jackie Robinson's head was a whole paragraph of Jackie Robinson's writings carved into the hair on the back of the statue, which he read and he remembered. 2 years later, he wrote a grade level award-winning essay on Jackie Robinson. But to him, it was the Q-tip man. So children get their own markers for how they remember things that we expose them to. So next slide is about a child brought a book to school. And the book was called Porky Pig Goes Aerobics. This is not the exact same book. But in the Porky Pig Goes Aerobics, a Bugs Bunny teases Porky Pig. It says, "You're too fat. You should take some aerobics classes." So in the storybook, Porky Pig goes to an aerobic class, and there's 99 people there, no other pigs or bunnies. My children pick up the book and say, "There's nobody that looks like us in this book. Look at all those hair colors. There's no medium brown, there's no dark brown, there's no black hair. And look around our room. We all have dark brown or black hair. Isn't this a strange book? I wonder where these people are from." So previous to that, obviously, the children had become aware of looking for representations of themselves. So this book came from a supermarket, but it could just as well come from the head of literacy curriculum in a school or a district or a preschool. Next. Also, the number of books available to families of low income is very, very low compared to the number of books available to middle income communities. So what can we as teachers do to right that wrong, to get some balance, to get more literature into the classroom and homes? And we spend a lot of energy in this direction. Next slide. We do another field trip. This is the grave of Owen Brown, the son of John Brown, the liberator. It's just in a corner behind a restaurant in Pasadena. Next. So we get to talk about who was John Brown and why did his son, Owen, come to Pasadena. And then the children wanted to compare pictures because some textbook images of John Brown are very strange. Like in the slide before this, you saw John Brown as a wild man with a gun and a Bible. Well, we get to compare that to the actual stories or the writings of John Brown, who was a father and he was religious and he was against slavery, but he wasn't a wild man as pictured in that book on the right. Next slide. The next thing we do in early childhood anti-racism is we get active in our professional groups. And we voluntarily, you'll never get paid for this, folks, voluntarily create posters and scenes and activities and collect songs and books and put them on display at our professional organizations. And this is what we have done for 20 years in the California Association for the Education of Young Children. And sometimes we even go to the National Association. And once we get 2 or 3 groups working on anti-bias education, then we set up a whole center, maybe a whole ballroom of a conference hotel with the theme of anti-bias education. Okay. All of this information came from a book that we worked on and started reading called Anti-Bias Education for Young Children and Ourselves. We have a new edition just out this spring called the second edition, and it'll be in the GCC bookstore this fall because I require it for one of our classes. So please send in your questions by following the directions, and we're switching speakers now. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. So you can't run away from who you are, but what you can do is run toward who you want to be. And that's the author Jason Reynolds in the book Ghost. So now we're going to talk about how do we choose books to read to and share with children in middle childhood, which is generally around 7 to 12. And something that I wanted to share with you all, this is Mary Jane again, something that I wanted to share with you all is a book that I read with 3rd and 4th graders called The 100 Dresses. And in middle childhood, children are concrete learners. We know this in terms of their cognitive development and how they understand the world around them. And by concrete learners, we mean they learn by doing and from personal experiences. And using books, we can tap into this and allow them to see themselves and to see other perspectives. And one way we did this with 3rd and 4th graders, I took this beautiful book, which is over 100 years old, written by Eleanor Estes and illustrated by Lois Sulbankin. And the story is essentially about a girl who was teased and isolated because of her socioeconomic status, because of her last name. And I read this with this group of 3rd and 4th graders by first establishing some terms, exactly the way we did at the very beginning of this presentation. And I introduced terms like bias, like assumptions. And then as we read the book, we connected those terms to things that were happening in the book. And the children were able, well, they had a bias against her because of her last name. They had a bias against her because of where she lived. And so I was able to start to give them concrete examples of these more abstract, complex terms. And once we finished reading the book, we talked about our own feelings and how sometimes we make assumptions about people based on what they look like, based on their skin color, based on their hair texture, based on where they live. And we did active role playing with the children where we had them come up with a scenario in pairs, and they developed scenarios where we introduced the concept of an internal dialogue, the things that you think in your head. It doesn't make you a bad person. We all have biases. We all make assumptions, but it's what you do with it. And so we talked about, in your role play, create a scene where somebody is making an assumption about somebody, and how do they interrupt it? And the children, it was incredible. You know, these simple steps of 8, 9, 10-year-old children allowed them to go through this process of seeing that they can have these thoughts that come into their head, these thoughts that come to them from the media, from the society they live in, from stories, from experiences that they've had. But they can recognize these assumptions that they're making and that they're developing biases and interrupt them. One example I wanted to share is that I had 2 children who were pretending to be on an airplane. And the boy was supposed to be a little boy, and the girl was supposed to be an adult woman in their role play. And the boy was on his iPad and looking at a My Little Pony TV show. And the woman kind of, the girl who was playing the woman narrated her inner dialogue for us, judging the boy for watching My Little Pony and saying, that's for girls. Why would he be watching that? That's so ridiculous. But then she also narrated for us, interrupting that. Well, when I was younger, there were shows that were just meant for boys or girls, or that were just meant for boys that I liked. And so why am I judging this boy? And so again, in middle childhood, they see things concretely. And so really laying it out for them how they can interrupt those assumptions that are going to plague us our whole lives. And so that was one very meaningful example for me that we did that allowed me to see that we can and must do this work with children. Okay. Sandy.
Thanks so much, Mary Jane. Okay, so for me, I'm going to be talking about how I choose books to read and share with adolescents and adults, given that I primarily teach college students. And first, I have a quote to share from you from Cesar Chavez. Once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. We have seen the future, and the future is ours. Okay, so here are, oh, whoa, where'd that go? Could we refresh that, Mary Jane? I think that's like not showing up. Sorry, one moment, folks.
Yeah, here, I'm gonna stop sharing real quick.
Okay, well, I can just start talking too. That's fine. I don't need a visual. Okay, so what does this look like? So for me, this means centering the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in my area. So I teach sociology. By and large, the folks that are included in the textbook are white men, right? So we don't have the inclusion of very many women, especially early influences, even though they existed, as well as Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so one of the things that I do is purposefully highlight those authors and read their works with my classes. The other thing is, those of you who know me know that I'm huge on active learning. So not only is it really important to me to expose students to a variety of different authors and perspectives and diverse ideas, but it's also important to me then to do something with those readings. So here are 4 ideas I have for you. In case you're thinking like, what can I do? I do sometimes in some classes an artifact activity where you bring in an artifact and you can have conversations about it. It really gets students not only talking, but learning a bit about different people's backgrounds. Discipline biographies, I love this assignment. Students have done them on W.E.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, and more recently, some kind of more recent people of color in the field, such as Michelle Alexander, and then one of my favorites is Layla Saad as well. You can also do a historical assignment. I think that through this experience, many of us are learning that we could probably all, right, tap into history a little bit more often. So that's one of my other favorites. And then, of course, service learning, right? I have had students then become inspired to take on service learning projects in our class as a result of some of the readings that they read, and they end up doing things that they otherwise would not have been exposed to. So Churla has actually been reportedly one of my students' favorites. Thanks, Mary Jane. On to anti-bias goals. Bill will take it away.
So we've given you a summary, a brief overview of several age groups and how we do our work. And now we want to focus on what's the framework for choosing an activity. And we have, from the research with children, young and middle-aged, and it somewhat overlaps with the adults that we work with, we've come up with 4 specific goals to help us keep focused and help keep students learning. So one's identity, one's diversity, one's justice, and one is activism. Now this is an upgrade from any old multicultural curriculum that you have taken. Especially goals 3 and 4 are rarely included in a multicultural curriculum. And that's one of the aspects of anti-bias education that made it so significant and so many people were interested in adopting it or reading about it. So the gears are here to say that anytime you tweak one of those goals, it interconnects with other issues. So if you read a biography of a person who's saying my identity is, my experiences are, it makes you think about your own identity or another allied group's identity. And if you talk about justice for one person or in one situation, in one setting, it makes you think about other diverse groups and who stood up and who didn't stand up. So we always know that if we start to talk about one of these four, people are going to be keyed into thinking about allied goals. So let's look at goal number one, identity. Next slide, please. So what does identity look like? So identity for us is also not a shallow, your name and your family and the country that your people came from recently or a long time ago. It is nurturing each child's construction of knowledgeable and confident personal and social identities. Personal means the individual. So one day a student brought to classroom some things that had to do with her identity, and she had made a paper doll, but it has a real cloth dress, and the cloth was important to her for a certain reason. The child is speaking in the home language of the student, and the child brought a watch because she now times her activities and keeps on track for functioning for her goals. And these are two simple things that tell us a lot about her that she decided to share. So social identity would be taking this to another level. Who else is similar to you in how you've identified yourself? And there are larger and larger groups that you are connected to. There are other people who have a keyed in cultural time check. Are they on track? Are they paying attention to what they want to do? There are other people who have similar favorite fabrics and clothes, and they touch off family memories and identity memories, maybe even from an original country memory. And we ask and observe, will children demonstrate self-awareness, confidence, family pride, and positive social identities? Next. So identity is pictured in many ways. So some people have a focus on years ago, or the oldest person in their family, or something from the country they originally were living in, or their family was living in. And sometimes it's very, very current. You know, I got this doll for my child because, and a story of how this student is communicating her identity and culture to her young child now. And then you do art activities. We love to include art activities that makes much more widespread ways you can spread knowledge about yourself and spread knowledge about what you think is important and what you believe. And so this is a partly written, partly labeled, partly collage, partly flowers, partly people, that is part of helping college students and young children be very concrete about what they know about themselves, how they describe themselves, which puts in a protective layer of when something negative might be targeted to them. You must have a strong personal and social identity as one step to deflecting oppression that's aimed at you, whether it's a bad word or a bad policy, without that basis of confident of who you are and what you think is fair for you, then you're more vulnerable. So we believe that this must be extremely well done. And we watch for children. How are they interacting? Do they exhibit this confidence? Next. So our identities are individual and social. So they are us and things that we remember and incorporate from our family and that we choose to add from our school or our extended visits outside of our family. And there are other people very, very similar to us, whether we're all 3-year-olds in the same classroom, or we're all of this ethnicity, or we're all of this gender. And we key our ears to the negative things that are said or that we want to question that are said about our ethnicity, our gender. Okay, so that's been identity, goal 1.
Thank you so much, Bill. Okay, so I have goal number 2, which is diversity. So what does this look like? This looks like empathetic interaction and comfort with people of all backgrounds. This is when we emphasize joy and comfort with human diversity and using accurate language for human differences and forming deep, caring connections across all dimensions of human diversity. I also want to engage in some myth busting with you all on the very next slide on kind of how we accomplish this. So we accomplish this goal of diversity by guiding children to be able to think about and have words for how people are the same and how they're different. One of the, I guess, pitfalls and people's thinking sometimes about this goal is that encouraging children to notice and learn about differences among people encourages prejudice when we know that it doesn't, right? And so I also want to give you a quick heads up. We didn't tell you earlier, but we have a 4-question quiz for all of you after we're done with these 4 goals. And as Bill mentioned earlier, the most important goals are arguably, right, are 3 and 4. So those are the ones that we're going to focus on. Go for it, Bill.
Thank you, Sandy. So goal 3 is about justice. Teachers will foster each child's capacity to critically identify bias and will nurture each child's empathy for the hurt that bias causes. So the illustration here is a commemorative stamp to the lawsuit by the Mendez family versus a school district in Southern California. This parent took the child to school, and the school said, well, you have 5 kids, so we'll send 3 of them to a black school and 2 of them to the white Latino school. And this parent was socially connected, and she ended up with lawyers and filed a suit in California under the California Constitution about fairness and non-discrimination. And she won her lawsuit. So California schools were desegregated because this parent and her social connections and her legal connections and probably her fundraising connections brought this lawsuit and won. And this is an example of justice starting and being implemented very close to us and affecting the future of California schools. So another part of this is social emotional, which is, so you have the words that you think are bias. We may label some behavior we think is bias, but then we have to learn about the feelings that are created inside of us. And how do we label that feeling? Do we need a new word? What are the choices of words? What if we're angry and mad and sad at the same time? What's the word for that? So it's expanding children's understanding of their feelings, expanding their thinking about their feelings, and expanding their thinking about information and which information they decide is unfair and hurting, and which information is acceptable, and where to go for resources. Who do I ask about this word? I used to have 15 minutes a week in my classroom of elementary and preschool, you can ask about any word now. There's no bad words in the next 15 minutes. Do you know what these words mean? Have you heard new words and you trying to decide whether to use them or not? So the second part of this is children will increasingly recognize unfairness and injustice, whether it's sharing, whether it's an illustration, whether it's that advertisement that says every kiss begins with K. This is not a spelling lesson, because the rest of the advertisement is every kiss begins with K jewelers. We don't want our kids to think that they need to buy diamonds and jewelry to find love and acceptance and kiss other people. So we do a similar critical thinking about information when they hear about this group or that group or this person or that person, or bullying or disrespect or exclusion or you won't be my friend. When is that just interpersonal, and when is it bigger than interpersonal? And what are all the blossoming of language to explain all these complications and sort them out, and time and understanding? Next. So children naturally have a feeling of empathy. So we have every child practice keeping in touch with it and not pushing it down as an uncomfortable feeling. And we build the thinking about it and the vocabulary about it so it grows within them. And then we try to extend it. And we observe them to see when they feel uncomfortable, when they are avoiding something or someone. And we give them ways to figure out what's fair and unfair. So we talk a lot about, of course, sharing and things you bring from home and things you're using at school, and you're the first to pick it up. What about the next child and the third child who's waiting? What's fair and unfair? Who rides the tricycle next and why? These are basic lessons on a child understanding and feeling about fairness. Next. So, learning experiences include opportunities for children to understand and practice using the skills for identifying unfair and untrue images. There are stereotypes. There are images of humans that aren't fair. What are they? Why aren't they fair? Who decides? My goodness, I see a lot of pictures of this group or that group. Which ones are true and which ones are not? And how do I set up my cognitive filters to not believe a new image I see? Next slide. Okay, so one way that I did it in second grade is I had 3 shoe boxes. One was labeled, this is fair stuff, this is okay stuff, this is real stuff. The middle box was labeled, we got to think about this. We have to ask questions. We don't know if this is okay or not. And the third box is, this isn't me, this isn't us, this is an unfair illustration, an unfair picture. And the important thing about this lesson is to keep box number 2 full. You keep a lot of discussions going with a lot of kinds of things to give the child skills in analyzing graphics and photographs and settings of things. Something might be fair in one setting but not in another. And the kids always laughed when we had a picture of a Mexican American asleep next to a cactus. Everybody knew that was ridiculous because cactus has stickers. But then we broadened that to, do Mexicans sleep in the middle of the day? You know, do all Mexicans wear the serape and that hat? You know, what about our Mexican American families in the classroom, in the school, in the community? And those kinds of cognitive and socio-emotional expanding understanding. But the key goal here is, what are all the thinking and feeling skills? And to keep that going throughout the year as new things happen politically, as new ads for diamonds happen, as new ads for chewing gum happens. You know, are there stereotypes? As new ads saying this is a family happen, etc., etc. And thank you for listening to Goal 3.
Okay, so goal 4 is activism. And I think for a lot of us, we're there right now, right? We're wanting to know what we can do. And goal 4, for activism, I've taught very young children, and I know a lot of us feel like children, especially children preschool age and elementary school age, are too young to be active. But what we know, and what you've just heard from Sandy and Bill, is that the little ways in which we guide children to treat each other and to treat themselves are in their own ways forms of activism, and planting the seeds for standing up for yourself and for standing up for somebody else. And that's activism. That's getting children accustomed to saying, that's not okay. You can't talk to me like that. You can't call me that name. And somebody else saying, I'm going to stand with you if somebody else is calling you a name, or if somebody else is teasing you. And the teacher or the adult around very young children who we're planting these seeds for. But activism goes up through, hopefully you're never done with activism, but the educator, the parent, the caregiver in that situation, we can't villainize the child who is maybe engaging in the exclusionary behavior or the teasing behavior or the bullying behavior. We need to actively give them reasons why it's not okay and ways to express whatever it is that they're feeling that's causing them to want to exclude, bully, understand the behavior, rather than targeting the child for being exclusionary or for teasing or for bullying. So we want to start young, very young. Teach children to stand up for themselves and others. Support a sense of worth for all students, and that goes across up to teaching college age. You know, letting children and students know, and we may have students, regardless of what age we're teaching students, for those of us who are educators, who are coming to us with not a strong sense of self-worth. And so at whatever age we're receiving them, thinking about ways in which we can establish a sense of self-worth in them and let them know that they matter, and that they who they are matters, and that we see them as they are. Like I said, don't tolerate teasing, ridicule, or exclusion, but actively support the child who's engaging in that behavior. And then do something. Empower students to get active. And this can be in the classroom, but it can also be when children come in and have seen injustices in the world and want to talk about it. Instead of saying, yes, that's hard, talking about what can we do? What do you think we can do? Putting that power in their hands so that they know they don't just have to sit back and see what's happening, hear other people talking about it, but there are little ways in which all of us can do things that can start to make changes. Okay, and then in the next slide, we're going to see some ways that we can take action. This is a great resource from Teaching Tolerance. And I think if you look at this, these are ways that all of us, those of us with very young children, those of us teaching young children, those of us who are adults who may not have any children in our lives, can take action. You know, we can bring cans to a canned food drive. We can do cleaning up. We can explain curriculum to parents and colleagues, talk about these anti-bias goals. You know, by expressing to others, to people that we work with, that we're around, why it's important to talk to children and to talk to others about some of these issues is taking action, saying something, making change in your curriculum if you're a teacher, marching for a cause, organizing a canned food drive, participating in a community mural. I saw this happening, and we're seeing this happen now. I saw this happen with early elementary age children in New York City, and the conversations around the history of why they were making the mural, other murals that have been made are incredibly valuable. Standing up to a bully, speaking up, sorry, I'm going a little out of order. Signing an online petition, speaking up at a meeting, speaking up when you hear someone make a racist joke. This is scary. But when you hear someone say something that's racist, especially if there's a child around you, but even if there's not, you have to say something. Not saying something is telling the person it's okay. And you don't, and again, as going back to the child, you don't have to shame, well, you don't have to shame or be punitive with the person, but let them know you're not okay with it. Talking to a group of children about social justice, travel to a different country or different parts of this country. I know that's not possible right now. Voting on election day, writing letters, calling, writing emails makes a difference. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Mary Jane. All right, folks, it's time for that quiz I promised you. So if you go ahead and open up your participants box, you will find that you have a yes and no button. I have a screenshot of it under this activity page so that you see what it looks like, yes and no. Basically, we're just going to ask you 4 questions. They're true and false questions, right? So if there's a statement and you think it's true, go ahead and click on yes. If you think it's false, go ahead and click on no. You will just get 1 true or false statement for each of the 4 anti-bias goals that we just went over with you. All right, let's do that first one, folks. Okay, so your very first question. So this is again from anti-bias goal number 1. So here's your question. The first anti-bias goal is identity. Included in this is creating a space where the individual feels good about themselves. By the way, if for whatever reason you don't have the yes and no function, right, in yours, go ahead and use the reactions. That's completely fine. You can use the thumbs up to indicate yes, and I guess don't respond for no, or you can do, I guess we'll use clapping as no, that's fine. All right, so I'm looking at this. Okay, cool. Oh, you can also, by the way, feel free to type in the chat and you can send it over to me. We can do that too. Whatever technology you got, folks, we will work with it. All right, so Bill, let them know. Is this true or false? Oh, I think Bill's muted.
Yep.
Well, it was true, folks. It was true.
I agree, it's true.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. All right, folks, let's do number 2. So children learn prejudice from prejudice, not from learning about human diversity. Is this true or false? So again, feel free to type in the chat to me, or do the yes or no on the participants or the reactions. Whatever way you choose is fine. And I won't judge if you get it wrong. It's okay. All right, folks, send it in if you haven't already. All right, folks, and that one was also true. Children learn prejudice from prejudice. We don't learn to be prejudicial from learning about human diversity. In fact, we have the chance to appreciate it much more and understand it better when we are exposed to human diversity and are able to talk about it. All right, let's do review question number 3. Actively teaching justice allows individuals to identify biases in themselves and others. So same thing, folks, click yes or no, type in yes or no to me, or use the reactions. Either is fine. All right, folks. Bill, do you want to tell the folks again if this one's yes, true or false?
He didn't, yeah. It is true, Sandy.
It's true, folks. Thanks,
Yeah.
Mary Jane. Thanks, Bill. Sorry, I keep putting him on the spot. Yes, it is true, folks. All right, so we have one more. Mary Jane, this one's all you. So children in preschool are too young to take part in social activism. Yes or no?
What do we think? I'm having some people send me in their answers.
I love it.
All right, folks. And so the answers that I'm seeing, people got it, and that is definitely not true. Preschool children are more than capable of, in developmentally appropriate ways, for young children, but they're, as Sandy said, we don't teach them prejudice by exposing them to diversity, and we can teach them to stand up for others and themselves by exposing them to developmentally appropriate forms of activism.
Yep. And so before we kind of dive into our last couple of sections with you all today, I want you to go ahead and take a moment, open up your chat box, and if you have any questions or comments for us at this point in time, go ahead and type them in. Another thing too, just for you to know, if you're like, oh, I really have this question I want to ask, but I don't want people to know that it's me asking, that's okay. Please go ahead and just next to your question, type in, or comment, type in, please keep this anonymous, and I will absolutely honor that for you, okay? All right, so let's get back to our last section. Okay, so our last section is on how do we educate ourselves and others about racism. And so here's your quote from Beverly Daniel Tatum. While I think it is necessary to be honest about the racism of our past and present, it is also necessary to empower children and adults with the vision that change is possible. Concrete examples are critical. All right, folks, so I'm gonna go ahead and start this section up. So I think the first thing that we have to do when we're trying to have conversations about race in the classroom is getting right with ourselves first. So I want you to also know, I didn't mention this in the beginning, but what we'll do at the very end of this presentation is I'm actually going to share our Google Slides with you, because inside kind of the comment section are the resources for many of these things. And at the end, there's a lot of like linkable resources. And so we'll go ahead and send it to you. And so you'll be able to see this after our conversation. But so basically this comes from the Leading Equity Center. And so here are kind of the norms that educators should have for themselves before kind of diving into the classroom with these topics, right? And so here they are: respecting preferences and honoring experiences. And so this is like, if someone tells you that they experienced racism, no matter how you might feel about it, it's kind of like committing to respecting that other person's preference and honoring their lived experience. The second is to acknowledge bias and privilege. One of the things I encourage all people to do is to take all the implicit association tests that are available on the Harvard website. Those are really telling. And I actually am super honest with my students too. And I tell them like, hey, when I had some of these implicit association tests assigned to me in college, like I didn't get the same scores that I get now, right? And the famous one that I share all the time is that there's a gender one where you're kind of like associating like which gender do you associate work with. And what's funny about this, and also really sad, is when I was in college, I scored like a moderate association with associating men with working. And what was really weird about that is my mom worked my entire life, right? And yet that implicit bias showed. So I share stories like that all the time and share that, you know, your scores can change with time, exposure, experience, etc. And I don't have that implicit bias association anymore, so I'm really proud of it. So I encourage everyone to take those, kind of have an understanding of sort of what our own biases are, right? The next one is to own your learning. So I'm really honest with students about areas where I feel like I'm strong in this, and then, oh, I've come a long way with this one, and then I have quite a ways to go in this other topic. And so I'm also a big believer in like, if you ever stumble or don't know about something in the classroom, just be really honest about it. I prefer to be raw, vulnerable, and real rather than just kind of pretending like I know everything, because no one knows everything. And so I tell students that we're there to learn together. Okay, so the next one, communicate positive intentions. It's really important, especially when you might have students in your class that don't have good experiences previously with educators. They don't necessarily come into your classroom feeling like you have great intentions, right? And it's not personal, right? It's just about like previous experiences. That same can be said for other institutions, right? Like the one that is most forefront in my mind right now is like people's thoughts and feelings about police, right? And so communicate positive intentions. Don't expect students or families, if you work with any for young children, don't expect them to kind of presume that you have positive intent just because you're an educator, right? Communicate positive intentions very clearly, explicitly, and often. The next thing is to avoid making assumptions or inferences about particular racial or ethnic groups based on limited or biased samples, right? So just kind of be careful that your sources are credible if you are going to have conversations about this. The next is to reject color blindness. So to build relationships, it's really powerful to connect with students and families over similarities, but do not neglect to celebrate differences, right? Like refuse to be colorblind, right? Next is consider context. So it's really important that we remember like time and place, right? Social and historical context in which we operate. So we have to approach any conversation that we have, acknowledging our position as a member of the majority when we are, right? And so, you know, when talking about white privilege, right? I tell my students that although I come from a community of color, I indeed am very white passing and as a result benefit from the system of white supremacy and white privilege, right? On a day-to-day basis. And I share examples with them in ways that like how I didn't know about that necessarily until I was enlightened, right? And after realizing more about this, I started to see how differently I was treated in the airports, for example, when I was alone or with just my other white passing sisters versus when I was with especially my dad, but sometimes also my brother, right? So I share those types of things with them. Also be open to being wrong. I think that also is connected to owning your learning. So approach every conversation with the goal of learning and understanding, not persuading or convincing. I know that can be so hard with some topics, and I feel like I always straddle the line with this one, to be honest, especially because I teach sociology, and where things are blatantly sexist, racist, etc. I debunk all of that, right? But as compassionately as I can, right? And lastly, get comfortable with discomfort. Just tell my students, like, I'm gonna get comfortable with discomfort, but you have to as well, in order for us to engage together, right? So basically, like, this is what I use to kind of help me center myself. And I also think that this isn't just for like educators. You can use this in like any context. So parents, when you're gearing up to have conversations about things, but also lately, for me at least, because I'm quarantining hardcore and I'm not really seeing people in person. So as you know, racial justice continues to become ever so centered in our society again more recently, I can't have dialogues about race in person right now because I'm quarantining, right? And so I have actually been engaging on Facebook threads quite often, which is like not my usual form of like engaging with people on this at all. I never thought I would be that person where like every single time I see like, you know, a post that I'm like, ooh, this is factually problematic. I'm not usually one to like always jump in, right? But now I can't help it. I can't help it so much that I'm even on Nextdoor, you know, to like see what my community, members of my community are saying. And I jump in all those threads, right? But that's just like my way of having conversations with people right now. And so I use this to also, you can even use this to center yourself on like, I'm about to gear up for some social media arguments, right? So you can use this for anything. All right, so using these, right, or these tenets, I guess, I think it's really important to create communal norms in your classrooms. This is one of the examples Mary Jane's used this a lot in workshops before. You might have seen it, especially for hot moments. So I think it's really important to set community norms. You can do this either with, like, for example, just using something like this that's already ready-made, maybe augmenting it a little bit to fit your classroom, the topics that you're talking about, and just your personal preferences, etc. Another way that you can create community norms, though, is just to create them from the ground up, right? You can just ask students at the very beginning of the semester. For me, I always do this during the first or second week of every single semester. We do norms together. So you could either say, like, what would an ideal classroom look for you, given that we are going to talk about all of these things, right? And so what do you expect of yourself? What do you want from me? What do you expect from your peers? And just create a list together. Sometimes this might take up like literally half a class though, right? And when we're ever so stretched on time, sometimes, especially in like survey classes, when we have so many topics to cover, another option is to start out with a list and then say, okay, let's tear this apart now, right? What do we want to take out? What do we want to add? What do we want to clarify, right? And so for me, what I personally use after having, tried a bunch of different ones is I now pass down the community norms from the previous class. And then we start with that one. So we're not starting from scratch for every single class. We're starting from a document, but students are creating that document to fit their particular personalities and what might be happening at that point in time in society and a bunch of other factors, right? So I hope that's useful. I have a couple other things to share with you. So one of the other things I do, I love doing this in my classes, it's called the social identity wheel. Sometimes I've done this kind of more informally. Sometimes we just talk about our social identities rather than completing the identity wheel. But I think completing the identity wheel is really, really powerful. And by the way, again, quick side note, under each of these wheels, there is a little link that'll take you to a page where you can just print these out yourself for your classes or post them on campus since we're remote now. But so for this social identity wheel, it asks you to consider all of your social identities and in what areas you might experience or you might be a part of a marginalized identity and in what areas might you have privilege. And the idea of this activity is to truly understand our social location. But also, at least for me, like one of the things that I do afterward is I'll do like a think, pair, share. So I pair students off with like a partner in their group and they'll talk about their social identities, the intersections. They reveal privileges and oppressions that they might have experienced in their lives, but also in their pursuit of higher education. And then after that, we'll do like a larger group discussion, right? So we'll talk about how we can invite those identities into our classes and celebrate diversity, right? And for that second wheel that's over here, my colleague actually created this trauma wheel last year. I love it. I feel like it truly takes into account other kind of experiences beyond just those that are in the social identity wheel. I highly recommend it. Again, if you're interested, there's a link to it. So another thing that I do is talk about identity and privilege a lot, given that it is sociology, right? So we'll talk about dominant identity and how that's an identity in which someone experiences privilege. We'll talk about subordinate and minoritized identities, so identities in which someone may be oppressed. We talk about multidimensionality, so how various social identities intersect, and then intersectionality, which of course comes from Kimberly Crenshaw, so how systems of oppression intersect, right? And so the other thing that I end on, because I think it's so important when you're talking about privilege to highlight this, is that we all have some privilege, right? So if we go to the next slide, I have some things that I show on there. So basically talk about how privilege is unearned access to social power based on membership in a dominant group, and that every single one of us has privilege, right? The types of privilege and degree to which we have them differs from person to person, but every single one of us has privilege, right? And that we don't want to shy away from having those conversations. but we want to be able to bravely tackle them, right? And so I also love these images, right? A lot of times, you know, I definitely get some pushback with white fragility, white guilt, etc. And I'm just like, yo, don't hide your privilege, like use it, right? Like use it to help other folks, right? It also is a reminder, privilege is when you think something is not a problem because it's not a problem to you personally, right? And so that's something we also talk about is the areas in which you are privileged are those areas where you feel like all is well with the world? And if so, why? Let's dive into that. So thank you all. I think we're gonna take it away with the next speaker now.
Okay, thanks, Sandy. I'm sharing this. This is kind of bouncing off of what Sandy was sharing with some of the ways in which she sets the norms for her class. I have done this. I've taught children as young as 3 up to 4th grade, and then obviously I also teach at the college level. But when I would teach with young children, I always knew, whether, you know, when we were in preschool, we talked about what it means to be a boy. We talked about different skin color. We talked about lots of different things. And so at the beginning of the year, and it would build on through the whole year, I would actively have them, the children, talk about ways that they can talk about things that are private for them, that might be sensitive for them, how they can talk about it in our classroom and feel okay about sharing that and what they want from their community. And so, and these are taken from 3rd graders. When I've had it, I rummaged through a lot of notes for this, but you know, the be kind was coming from preschool children. And the don't laugh or whispers when others are talking, that was coming from 3rd and 4th graders. But I'm saying this because for those of you who have young children or who are going to be working with children, you can elicit from them, how do you want to create a space where you feel free to ask a question? You know, to say, why is she different than me? And also to say, I didn't like it when you called me that. Like, how can we create that? We can start these kinds of conversations and ways for children to set boundaries when they're very young. So be kind, stand up for yourself, stand up for others, listen when others are talking. It's okay to say how you're feeling. Don't laugh or whisper when others are talking. All questions are okay to ask. I loved that one because especially as children get older and they start censoring themselves, they can get nervous to ask questions. So then I think we're going to launch into some of what I do on the next slide about a little bit, not as much of how I teach anti-racism in the class, but the ways in which I try to understand where my student is in terms of their stage of racial awareness. And like I said, I teach, you know, I've taught children as young as 3, and then I teach adults. And so one of the things that I have been made aware of is that it doesn't matter your age, it's your experiences and your exposure is where you're coming into your stage of racial awareness. And whatever your background, whatever your race, your experience, your exposure is going to inform where you are at any given time in terms of your understanding of your own racial identity and those around you, and your acceptance, your understanding of those around you. And so this is not a one size fits all framework. It's a loose framework. I don't put anybody in it and say, oh, she's in that stage, but I use it to loosely understand where somebody in my class might be so that I can know how to best support where they are now and help them move forward in their understanding. And not to say that I'm at some, extreme level of racial awareness. I'm still working, and as Sandy said in her norms, I'm still admitting when I'm wrong and here to learn. But it helps me to have this framework to understand where the children or the adults in my class might be. So I'm not, again, jumping on anybody or making assumptions myself when they may say something that to me, seems like they're not where I am. And we're not all going to be in the same place, and that's okay. We need to have compassion for each other of where we are in order to be able to grow and develop. Because I'm not, like I just said, I'm not, at some high level. I'm working and listening and trying to understand as well. So a little caveat: most of the framework carry the same few cautions. And for the purposes of what we're going to look at tonight, there are many groups within these frameworks. For the purposes of not going on for too long tonight, we're going to look at Black American racial awareness and white American racial awareness. So not every person will necessarily go through every stage in a framework. Many of the authors specifically acknowledge that the stage might be cyclical, that people might revisit stages at different points in their lives. You could have things that come up that kind of push you back to another stage. And we're going to go over the stages really briefly, but just to kind of give you a sense of what they are in just a moment. The frameworks summarized here describe people who are situated in many different ways, but do not describe all of the possibilities. So if you're listening to my quick blurbs about each identity, and you're like, well, I don't think that I'm in there. That's okay. It's like I said, it's not describing all of the possibilities. It's some of the possibilities. And it's just to kind of give us a place to start. We think they can be useful tools for self-reflection and for building empathy and understanding of people who are situated differently from ourselves. Okay, so next we're going to actually look at some of the stages. And so the Black American racial identity. The first stage for this is the pre-encounter. And again, this is not a stage everybody's going to be hitting, but according to this framework, the first stage being pre-encounter would be an individual who is taking in the dominant white culture around them and considering that's the best culture, and that's where we're supposed to, the culture that we're supposed to be following. And so white is the way to be, so to speak. And then going into encounter is acknowledging as a Black American that they are part of a group that is targeted by racism. And that part going into the encounter is forcing somebody to realize that they are a member of a group that's being targeted. And then going on from there, they're going into the immersion stage, which is where an individual is wanting to take on their own culture. It's kind of the counter to the first pre-encounter. It's their wanting to explore and identify and understand with their own background. And then going into internalization is after you've felt like you've studied and had a deeper understanding of your own background, wanting, starting to branch out and feeling more secure in your own racial identity, and then looking around at what others are doing. Maybe white people who are being active in social justice. And then the internalization commitment is this place where somebody's developed a strong comfort in their own racial identity, and they are then actively wanting to make change and work with others who are actively wanting to make change as well. And so those are the stages of Black American racial identity. Again, a framework, not a something that's locked in, and not something that people may come in and out of depending on experiences, depending on personal situations. And then we're going to look at the white American, or the white identity framework on the next page, white racial identity model. And the first stage of this is contact. And this is often kind of called the colorblind stage. And I wanted to really quickly touch on this because we've hit on the idea of colorblind a couple of times tonight, and just understanding that when we say children aren't colorblind, it means that they see differences. And it's important for us to help them to develop a language to talk about and understand differences. So in the contact stage, children or individuals aren't necessarily, they're saying, oh, I don't see race, or I believe everybody's equal, because they haven't kind of seen past that original space of other people other than themselves are being discriminated against based on their skin color. And then the disintegration piece is kind of going into an understanding that there's racism and feeling bad about it and feeling guilty about it. And then the reintegration we move into is sometimes acknowledging that white people in this country have more power, but saying maybe there's a reason why, and maybe we're supposed to. And then the pseudo-independence stage is going into a positive racial identification. They're understanding that racism is an issue. It's not a place where white people should have privilege or power over others. But in the pseudo-independent stage, they're looking to Black people, to people of color, to solve it or to fight the fight on it. They're supportive but not getting active. And then in the immersion stage, there's a beginning to develop a sense of being anti-racist and thinking about attempts that how can I be white and also be anti-racist. And then going into the autonomy phase, it's having an acceptance, an understanding of who I am as in cultural identity, and then having an understanding of who I am as a white person and who I am as an active anti-racist person who's committed to social justice. And that's all for that stage.
Thanks, Mary Jane. If you could take over the screen share.
Oh, sure.
That would be great. Our ASGCC moderator is to go to another session.
Oh, no. Okay.
Yeah, so take it over. We have one last section with Professor Bill Sparks, everyone, and then we'll share basically a couple of action items for you and resources, and then we'll get right to that Q&A. So keep sending those questions over.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks everybody for hanging in. We're almost done with the presentations and the questions have been outstanding. So,
let's go here. I'm gonna go forward. Sorry for the dizzying.
That's all right. I can deal with it. It's like, it's not a flash mob, but it's a flash.
Go for it.
So I am talking about college teaching as an anti-racist act. And Sandy and Mary Jane took pretty much a process strategy with some themes of content. I'm going to be very specific about our textbooks because if you go shopping for an anti-racist textbook for your class, you're going to be very frustrated. So one of the strategies to increase the understanding of racism is to deconstruct the text you're given. or deconstruct the classic text in your field. Now, first I want to define our field. I'm talking about textbooks in the child development department. Our textbooks are a mixture of educational research, psychological research, social science research, and other kinds of research. And it's woven together to help people understand children's growth and development and education for children. So I opened one textbook and it talked about our community is diverse, and it had a picture of a apartment building with a sidewalk that's broken up, potholes in the street, and trash on the street. What's racist about this picture? Well, people who live in an apartment house, they're not in charge of the pavement, of the sidewalk. They're not in charge of fixing the potholes in the street. They don't control how many times a week the street is swept. So this image tried to say that the people in the apartment building in a low-income area are responsible for the decline of the area, as if they went out at night and dug holes in the street or something. I was furious, and one of the things we do is we also write letters. Dear publisher, this is not an illustration of poor people, and this is an illustration of a city government that's broken. Next. Another example. So I was using a book in 28, and it had very little, 2008, yes, 2008. And it had very little references to diversity. But there was a lot of pressure on that publisher. So the next year, she put out a flyer listing all the times that she mentions diversity in her textbook. But all she did was put the word diversity in any context, in any phrase. There was no analysis, no anti-racism anywhere. But she sure is proud that she sprinkled diversity, like putting a little bit of salt all over your scrambled eggs. So that didn't fly. But again, it can be exposed. Adding the word diversity doesn't mean you change the context, the meaning, new research, and does any of it give you tools to fight racism? Next. Another outline is a basic issue in our field of psychology and education. And because all of the basic beginnings of our fields were done when racism was at a high level in the colleges that were writing the foundation and the foundations of the field. They were starting the journals. They were the first textbooks writers, and racism was rampant. So what did they do as a foundation? How did they decide to measure human behavior? How did they document it? What foundation theory did they write as this is going to be what we're going to grow from? And so this is something that should be looked at, because we have often found there is major structural problems with some of the educational, psychological, and social science theories that were created without an anti-racist perspective. Next. So as social scientists, we as teachers do some active research, but our fields of education, psychology, I won't say the three fields over and over, the three fields. So if you frame the question of what's wrong with these people, let's give them a psychological test. Let's give them a this kind of test, that kind of test. Let's interview them. Let's have quality research where we do in-depth family studies. So if you're looking for the problem in the person, that may not be appropriate at all. What if the person is functioning in a low-income area or a racially targeted ethnic group? The problem is not inside the person, and you end up blaming the victim. Oh, we did this research, and this is the personality of those people, as if that personality issue or that lifestyle issue, and for a while in the 1980s, it was called a cultural issue. So we have to watch out in our fields for blaming the victim. Next. So another foundation mathematical issue in all of our fields, all three fields, is how did we get to the bell-shaped curve as the normal representation of the human behavior? Well, we got there because in the 1800s, physical science was developing, and their accuracy of measuring was developing. So they had these scales and these metallic measurements of a foot and a yard, and the fractions of a foot and the fraction of a yard. And they could measure the physical world until you were sick. Yes, we measured 1,000 bees, and we found a few that were very small and a few that were very large, but most of them were average weight. So they did that throughout the physical world. So as social science was in its germination, social science says, what standard are we going to use as for how we measure, how we test our tools? And the physical scientists attacked us and said, you've got to adopt the bell-shaped curve. It is in nature. It is the actual nature of the whole world. You know, we've measured granite, we've measured trees, we've measured bees' antenna. And this is the shape of the world. You have to adopt this in the social sciences, as this is the normal, mathematically proven way to look at the world. And many social scientist foundations fell for it. There is actually no reason to fall for it. Maybe human behavior is different than the weight of bees and the amount of calcium in granite. So we have to look for any social science tools that are normed to fit the bell-shaped curve. And what's one example of that? One of the first screening tests for humans' intelligence came out of France. The leaders of France said, we want more students in our colleges in Paris. So we're going to hire you, Mr. Pre-psychologist, to go out into the farming areas and find the smart people, and so we can bring them into the college. So this guy took on the job. He goes out and he tests kids, and he says, I brought you a list of 10,000 smart people. And Paris said, wait a second, we only need 5,000. Change your test so that it gives us the top 5,000. So the guy actually went out and rewrote the test. So now IQ was defined as you're in the top 5,000. And that became another misuse of testing and assessment. When we did the first IQ tests with girls and women in the United States, the girls and women's curve was 3/4 of the way towards the smart section. And the psychologists were mandated to go back to make the girls' bell-shaped curve match the less smart boys. And the psychologists at the time did it. They went back and brought down the intelligence of the average woman. So these are foundation things that we need to question. Next. So there's also high quality anti-racist research. And when we find it, we should celebrate it. So let me ask a question to the moderator. So Mary Jane, how many slides do I have left?
I'm actually not sure because I can't see all the slides.
I can answer that. So you have a handful, but like 3 of them are photos.
Okay, so I think I'll just end with this one. So we get a good solid question and answer. Get those questions in fast. So in our field, we have high quality research that use the best scientific methods and the best cross-testing and the best retesting. And the longest, looking at these students over 50 years, they were in preschool in 1962 in a control and an experimental group. And funds were raised to reassess these preschool students and their children in the control and experimental groups up through last year. And here's the conclusion. A new research analysis, that means 2019, from a Nobel laureate economist, James J. Heckman, finds that targeted, high-quality early education investments have the power to lift multiple generations out of poverty. So this isn't a conclusion by a human relations specialist, a good-hearted teacher, some isolated social scientist. This is an economist looking at social science research, saying it has dollar measurables. Dollar measurables. How many of these preschoolers went to jail, had counseling, had failed relationships, had jobs, had an average salary? And he quantifiably measures the difference between having a high quality early childhood education and no preschool education. And then he found out it worked for the second generation too. My goodness. We in early childhood education can work, and we do work, magic, a combination of science and art. Come join us. Be a teacher.
Thank you so much, Bill. So these are basically the few slides that we had left. And then basically what's next is we're going to talk a little bit about a call to action, some resources, and then we're going to dive into that Q&A. Thank you, Mary Jane. All right, folks, so what can we do? So here's a quote by James Baldwin: "The world changes according to the way people see it, and if you can alter, even by a millimeter, the way people look at reality, then you can change it." And that is what I'm attempting on Facebook and Nextdoor these days. All right, folks, so doing the work. So we have 3 actionable steps for anyone to take part in. First is listen to and amplify BIPOC voices. So it's Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We also want you to know that we're going to run something called Justice in, it's actually called Justice in June, but since it's already June and it's a 30-day kind of challenge, we're calling it Justice in July. I'm linking that in the resources as well that you'll get in the Google Docs or the Google Slides in a moment. But basically someone has created this really fabulous resource called Justice in June. And what it basically does is if you're super overwhelmed with these really long resource lists these days that are coming out, which are like amazing, but what I fear sometimes folks do is they just kind of like bookmark it for another day and maybe don't get to it, right? So what Justice in June does is it kind of has a setup where you can choose if you have 10 minutes free every single day to do some reading or listening or watching on the topics of racial justice, or if you have 25 minutes, or if you have 45 minutes. And so you kind of choose the amount of time that you can dedicate, that you have available in your schedule. And then for 30 days, that's how many minutes you read, right? So 10 minutes a day, 25 minutes a day, 45 minutes a day. And so we want to do that challenge together as an institution. And so we will send out more information about that via email, but there will be a space for GCC employees to come together and process the things that we're reading, and also spaces for students. So we'll follow up with that. Another thing that you can do is find your role in the social change ecosystem. So some of us are in a position to donate money to organizations. Others of us want to march and protest. Others of us can be active on social media or having discussions with family or friends that really need someone to kind of be talking about these issues with. And so whatever it is that your role is, it's important, right? And so the goal is to figure out what your role is and take part. It doesn't matter how big or small. The idea is you just need to start and you need to be a part of it, right? And then the third thing is, of course, vote. If you haven't yet registered to vote, please register to vote. And we actually intentionally left vote last. And the reason why is uninformed voting just isn't great, right? And so one of the things we want to do is make sure that we are as informed as possible when we're voting so that we can feel confident and proud of our choices and that we have a solid understanding on the impact of however way we're voting, right, for anything. And also just a quick side note, I know a lot of times when we talk about voting, everyone thinks of federal elections or national elections. And it's really important to keep in mind that you actually have greater say-so and power in local elections and state elections, right? So if you're not involved locally, man, this is the time, right? Okay, so then we also have 3 actionable steps for if you are somebody who has children in your lives, right? Whether you're a parent, guardian, or have nieces, nephews, whatever it may be, friends that have children, these are 3 things that you can do, right? Read to children about race, racism, and being anti-racist. Talk to the children about race, racism, and being anti-racist, and then listen to children's questions and assumptions about race, racism, and being anti-racist. So some resources up next for you. So those of you that have children in your lives, this is a list of resources for you. Every single one of these is hyperlinked. So when I put it in the chat box in like a couple of minutes, you'll be able to actually click through each of these. And then next, these are resources for educators. Folks, that first bullet point right there, that is my holy grail, right? Like this institute has compiled like one of the most thorough, inclusive list of resources I have ever seen, right? And I'm pretty active in the field, so trust me, right? That resource is so incredible, highly recommend it. The second one, I love this by Angela Watson. So 10 things every white teacher should know when talking about race. I also really like quick tidbit. I honestly think that that is a valuable article for anyone. I don't think that it's only valuable for educators. And so I highly recommend everyone actually take a look at that second one. And then the third one's actually the link to Justice in June, which again, for us at GCC, we're gonna call it Justice in July, and you'll get more information about that in email later. And also, I just got word too that the Glendale City Library is doing a reading online for Black Lives Matter. And I also want to, real quick before we dive into the Q&A, I also want to plug a couple of opportunities, particularly for educators in here too. One is the next 2 days are the online teaching conference. It is absolutely free this year, and there are several sessions on equity. I highly recommend them. And then also Sage is running a webinar on talking about race in the classroom. And so I will also make sure to send those out when I send out Justice in July. And it is time for our Q&A, folks. Thank you so much for all of the thoughtful questions that you all sent. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started in order. Okay, folks? So first question, and we have about 10 minutes to answer these, and here we go. What are ways that we can research more about the different cultures and ethnicities that are in our classrooms with our students?
So how do we choose who's going to answer?
However you want, whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'll start.
Well, okay.
So it depends on the age of the child, for one thing. But if it's very young children, you should talk to the parents of the families and ask them to tell you how they what cultural values they think are important for their child to take from their family, and how they do it. Do they do it through special days of the year? Do they do it through some other ways? And then there are unbiased sources about what life is like in your community where you're teaching, the ethnicity, the immigration situation, whatever it is. But you do have to read a couple of things and compare them to see who may be slanting it one way or another. So, okay, I'm going to pass it on now. Next question.
Oh, okay. All right. I guess in this way we can make sure we get to all of them.
Right.
The next one, unless you had something to add, Mary Jane.
No.
Okay. So the next one is, does teaching activism and justice result in political correctness?
No, it doesn't, because political correctness was invented in the campus struggles for the 1990s. So what was happening on campus was that women, gays or lesbian, transgender, and ethnic groups were saying, this isn't fair, that isn't fair, it hurts us this way, it hurts us that way. And there was a lot of resistance. And the resistance crystallized in throwing back the words, the stories, the feelings, and the sociological proof that racism and sexism hurts people. And the throwing back phrase was, you just want me to be politically correct. No, we don't want you to be politically correct. We want you to fix the oppression and stop it.
Yes, Sandy, I remember one of the first times I met you when we were talking about political correctness in a group, and you said, I see political correctness as being kind. And I think when it got twisted into this phrase that we're all afraid of being. And I've yet to meet a family member of a child who, if we're trying to model being kind to others, is saying, I don't want my child to be kind. And I think that I agree with what Bill said. I think, that word got twisted around.
Yeah, I agree. So our next one, what do you mean by white passing? Is it your internal feeling about yourself, or are you concerned about how your family writ large is received? I'll actually go ahead and take that one since I mentioned white passing. So when we're talking about white passing, we're really talking about like racial passing, right? So since white Americans are the dominant group, and I am kind of like lighter skin tone wise, I can pass for part of the dominant group much more than 2 or 3 of my family members can, right? My immediate family, there's 7 of us, right? So I, as a result, have privileges that 2 of my siblings and my dad may not have, right, from situation to situation. So that's basically what it means. It's just that I pass, and therefore pass for the dominant group, and therefore don't have race as one of the barriers in my life, right? So it doesn't mean I don't struggle in life. It just means that like race for me is not one of the areas that I'm going to experience barriers. Okay, the next question. You mentioned that in your classes, you share the norms established as in the previous class as the starting point for the next class. Is it important to share with the next class norms that might be seen as problematic? Why or why not? I'll go ahead and take that one too. So generally, like, I don't really have problematic norms that ever get suggested and actually stay on the norms list, right? So sometimes, you know, folks, and very well, you know, usually they mean really well, right, might suggest a norm that could be a little problematic, right, once we think about it a little bit more critically, but it generally never makes it on the list. And the reason why is it's not like a student says, hey, this norm should be added, and we just like add it. We have to, as a class, right, because they're class generated norms, as a class, they have to agree that that norm is necessary for healthy function of dialogue, right? Generally any problematic norms that get suggested upon kind of further discussion, they get thrown out. So they don't make it ever onto the official class norms. They're just part of the discussion. And what happens too is it becomes like a learning opportunity, right? So folks kind of recognize why the rules need to be, or the guidelines need to be what they are by the end of it, right? So they have a full understanding of why maybe something that they suggested isn't going to fly. But also, more often than not, I would add, what ends up happening is not that the norm gets thrown out entirely, because again, like 99% of the time, these are very well-meaning. What ends up happening is just that they get augmented, right? So people go like, hey, how about we like reframe it this way, right? That's what ends up happening by and large. And so, problematic norms do not get passed down, thankfully, from class to class. I couldn't bear them in one class, let alone in multiple. Thank you for your question. Okay, so I have another one. All right, y'all, this is a long one. Let's do it.
Okay.
Oh yeah, Bill.
Check the time before you take on a long one.
We have 3 minutes. I think we got this. We got this.
Okay.
So I would love any insight into how to raise children in a diverse family, any thoughts about how to talk to children of different ages. So they have a college graduate in the family, but also some that are in college, some that are in high school. This person says they're all coming up with their own ideas and they may or may not always agree politically. They say, basically, I have a family where myself, I'm not a Trump fan, and my husband has recently become one. It's challenging for sure. I have 2 boys and 1 girl. It seems that the boys are on one side and the girls are on the other. And the way that Trump is talking about defunding the police makes me sick. So again, to go back to that original question, you know, what are the tips and insights into how to raise children in a diverse family with clearly very diverse political thoughts?
I think the questioner could go back to the ways to have these conversations in the slides that you were sharing, where you were saying that you sometimes approach these norms when you're going on social media. I think especially with those age children, they're not young children, and so they're entitled to their opinions, but so are you as an adult with your own opinions. And I would keep on having the conversation. I mean, just sharing. I mean, that whole thing at the beginning, teaching is a transference of values. So is parenting. And talking about not engaging in being combative, but talking about what you believe and why. You know, why is it making you frustrated that somebody is listening to things that the president's saying? Or why is it, in my classes all the time, I try to encourage people to not so much as react to the behavior, but respond to the emotions behind the behavior. So maybe, trying to understand why they might be their perspective, but just trying to calmly explain why you believe what you do. Why do you do what you do, and why do you believe what you do?
Thanks, Mary Jane. Do you have something to add to that, Bill?
Yeah, I would say look at some facts. See if you can agree on some facts. See if you can agree on what makes a fact, what makes an opinion.
Yeah.
And thank everybody. This has been exciting.
Thank you so much, everyone. We have one more question for you, Bill. I don't know if you can tackle it super quick, but basically somebody asked, please talk about your background before education. What drew you to this field? So this question's for you specifically, my friend.
So I was looking at my mother's baby book recently. And the first entry, it said, this is Billy's first air raid drill. So I never thought of that as my first step into the world. But I was brought up when schools were segregated in a southern city, Baltimore, Maryland. Went to a segregated church, shopped in a segregated shopping center, and then started to branch out from that, starting to see the hypocrisy of people who were white racists and other things, and ended up teaching in a landmark integrated school. And then when Dr. King was killed, the intellectual and the emotional part of anti-racism came together. Because when he was killed, there was a book published by the federal government about the Kerner and Detroit, no, the Newark and Detroit riots. And this report, called the Kerner Report, said all of the riots are about institutional racism. And it had 15 pages on every American institution and all of the institutional practices that were racist. So I got my emotional and my intellectual view solidified there, and I've been active pretty much ever since.
Thank you so much, Bill. We appreciate every single one of you for joining us here today. I, in the chat box, wrote in all of our emails, so feel free to contact us if you need anything at all, have any more questions, comments, anything. And then also in the chat box, you will find the link to our entire slide deck. So you can go through and look at anything else that you want again, or maybe look at those few slides that we didn't get to today, and especially all the resources that are in the end that are hyperlinked. So thank you all so much again for such a fantastic session. I hope to see you all at tomorrow's session and Friday's closing session. And keep in mind, this is just the beginning. There's so much more to come. Thank you all. Have a great night.
Thank you so much, Professor Somo, Professor Biancheri, and Professor Sparks. If you have any questions that weren't addressed tonight, we just sent a link to an evaluation form where you can leave your questions or any additional feedback for tonight's lecture. We'll be addressing these additional questions at our closing forum this Friday, June 19th from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. on the same link. And yeah, please join us for the rest of this week's events on the same link at the same time. And more information can be found on glendale.edu/antiracism. And for GCC students, again, if you need just a safe space to kind of discuss everything we covered tonight or throughout this lecture series, we'll be hosting healing circles after each lecture, led by our student equity counselors. And tonight, there's also going to be a separate healing circle for GCC faculty and staff. So please join us on those separate links that were sent in the chat. And we'll be ending this meeting now to start both healing circles. Thank you so much again for joining us, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Bye.